he's a visual storyteller, and I think all of us experience that incredible joy, especially for editors, the way that these moments are dissected by him. Telling the story, breaks down the story. He was relying on the power of film and the visuals to tell these stories, which is what you see in all of his movies now. They're incredible shots and direction of focus.
I'm Isabel Sadurni, and this is Frame by Frame. In this episode, picture editors Bill Pankow and Kris Boden, supervising sound editor Dan Sable and Maurice Schell, and re-recording mixer Lee Dichter talk about their collaborations with director Brian DePalma. Best known for his films Dressed to Kill, Blow-Out, Scarface, and The Untouchables, Brian DePalma became a part of the new Hollywood generation of the 1960s and 70s, basing himself solidly in the New York filmmaking scene.
New York didn't do filmmaking by the books the way California did. They were totally wide open. It's interesting how the East Coast was the Wild West. It also gave freedom to all of us in our own areas of work, and picture and sound.
We didn't have these strictures in place like that had been in place at the beginning of cinema. Obviously, mostly began out there and developed, and they developed their own rules and ways of doing things, which New York didn't have to do.
No, we broke the rules.
Starting out as a science and tech whiz kid, building computers in high school in Philadelphia, and majoring in physics and Russian at Columbia University, Brian DePalma steadily developed his craft as a filmmaker, but it wasn't until his 10th feature, CARRIE, that he established his own cinematic signature, having otherwise mastered the visual grammar of suspense, psychological thriller, and crime drama. The host for today's episode is Warner Brothers Sound. You can share this conversation through the website bit.do/framebyframe or via Twitter at @postny. I asked Kris, Bill, Dan, Maurice, and Lee what kind of conversations they had when Brian DePalma first introduced them to a project. Dan Sable joined us via recorded telephone line.
In my case, it was just, he might talk about the storyboards a bit, but it's basically, Bill, I'm making a movie. You free? Yeah. When? Tomorrow. Okay. I mean, not literally, but it kind of felt that way a lot of the times. I remember starting on Casualties of War, which Chrissy and I worked on together, and it was the beginning, for me anyway, the beginning of awareness of computers, which Brian obviously was a computer maker. He was a genius in that area on his own right. Anyway, to begin Casualties of War, he knew that he was going to be in Thailand, and we in the editing room were not. Yeah. So we had to find a way to communicate because of the time difference. It would be difficult to talk on the phone. So there was a computer service called CompuServe where you could, it was like an email basically, the early email. So in order to try to get familiarize with me with that, he flew me out to his house in LA and sat me down in front of this computer. Now it was probably one of the first Apple computers, and I didn't know what a mouse was. I didn't know anything. So he tried to talk me through how to work the mouse and show things on the screen and how to get into how to connect with CompuServe. And that's what we did. We would pick up messages in the morning that he would say about the dailies that he had shot, or he wasn't seeing edits. And it was awkward because he would shoot and the dailies would go to London to be developed and sunk up. Then they'd go back to Thailand for them to watch it. Then they'd go to Los Angeles for the executives to watch it. And then we'd get them in New York, 2 weeks later, was it? Something like that? So it was already too late to do anything, but still we would leave them, if we had questions, we could leave it on the computer. And that's pretty much how we got through the shooting of Casualties of War. That was our connection. And I had tried with Kris in the editing room to bring the editing room into the digital age, I guess. So, right. And so I said to him, Brian, do you want to try editing this digitally? Which was pretty brave because the schedule, as Kris even knows, we started in April. And I think we did the mix in August.
It was released in October. Yeah.
So that was probably not a good idea. But I said I'm going to try. And he said, "Are you sure you want to give up your sewing machine?" Because the moviolas, as you know, were painted the same color as the sewing machines.
They sounded like one too.
And they sounded like one. Yeah. So anyway, I had many phone calls to Avid, and I would leave a message and saying, I'm working on a Brian DePalma film. We want to have a demonstration of your thing, and they never called me back. So probably a good thing at the time. We stuck with the film. Yeah. So besides having the apprentice or second assistant do all the normal work on paper, then when they finished, they had to enter the same information into this computer log sheet, and I was creating fields for this negative number and scene taken, and it was so much work for. Anyway, it didn't work out.
Right.
But software coders.
But it was an invaluable lesson because I didn't realize my life was going to be totally like that after that movie.
Right.
But you worked for Jerry, who
Greenberg.
Yeah.
Jerry Greenberg edited some of Brian's films, and that's where it was Dressed to Kill was the first one. Jerry was the editor, and I was his assistant. On Wise Guys, it was the same thing. On Body Double, I got to edit some scenes, and I felt good about myself. Brian had these 3 rooms on 1600 Broadway, and 2 of them were editing rooms, and 1 was a storage room. And in the storage room, we kept a spare moviola in case one broke. While Jerry was editing, we'd have one right away. We'd have to wait for the repairman. So Jerry would let me take some scene and go into the storage room and work on that moviola. And I can't tell you how many motors I burnt out, going back and forth, trying to make the decision of what to cut. But that's one of the first times I learned.
But because you got to do that, I was the apprentice, so I got to be Jerry's assistant when you were in the closet cutting. So these were Brian's own rooms.
So when you did Brian DePalma's film, you worked in those editing rooms at 1600 Broadway. I think it was on the 3rd or 4th floor. And I guess he had done several films before with Paul prior to us.
That's right.
That's where they.
Yeah, they did work there. Sound one was not even.
It wasn't Sound one yet.
And I don't know if he owned moviolas. I think we rented the moviolas.
Yeah, upstairs.
Right.
They had a.
There was a place in the building that rented moviolas.
Right.
But he had a lease on the rooms and the editing benches and reels and all the things you needed, bins and split reels and stuff like that was all there. And then when he started the film, we'd get to bring in the equipment and go to work.
I came on to working with him after Dressed to Kill, which I thought was an incredible piece of storytelling. So it was really exciting to see that level of detail. He wasn't relying on the script. He wasn't relying on the actors. He was relying on the power of film and the visuals to tell these stories, which is what you see in all of his movies now. They're incredible shots and direction of focus.
And then fast forward, Jerry was scheduled to do Untouchables, and he was busy. It was like maybe September, and he wasn't going to be free till November. But he must have suggested to Brian that why don't you let Bill start the film, and then when I finish this is Jerry speaking, when I'm done with my film, I'll come and join him, we'll finish it together. And that's what happened. We got almost to the first cut, I think, and then Jerry arrived, and it was the big Odessa Steps kind of sequence in the train station. I was a little bit intimidated, I'll say, but I also, as a respect for Jerry and his great craft, I wanted to leave that for him. And I would talk to him on the phone. He said, no, take a shot at it. Go ahead. And I said, oh, yeah, okay. But also, I was a little intimidated by the amount of material. So I was trying to get through as many scenes as possible, and I knew if I began that, it would take a lot of time. So another reason why I left it to Jerry. But what was nice about that time in filmmaking was that it was very physical. So it forced the assistant to be in the same room with the editor.
Exactly.
You had to hand them the pieces or
Right.
the pieces that they wanted, or if you try to anticipate what they might need to see if you were guessing properly so you were learning how to edit. Right. And at the same time, you were able to observe the dynamic between the editor and the director.
Right.
And you learned about that too, because that's obviously very important. And Brian would look over Jerry's shoulder, and Jerry would make a cut, and he'd show it to him on the moviola. And then Brian would say, well, maybe you want to change this, get this other take. So it would take a few minutes. He rolls of film on the table, and Brian would go out in the hallway and smoke a cigarette, and then come back in, and then Jerry would show it to him. So that wasn't like all day, every day, but there were plenty of instances when that happened. And it was a way that we could learn as the assistants or apprentices in the room and see what that dynamic was about, and also to just observe the way Brian was. And he was always very... I think he was always very respectful of whatever your craft is, whether you were the sound editor, or mixer, or editor, apprentice, assistant editor. He was always he is still always respectful of what people do, and is very sensitive to that. And that's one of the wonderful things working with him.
I'm your host, Isabel Sadurni, and this is Frame by Frame, in conversation with Lee Dichter, Bill Pankow, Kris Boden, and Maurice Schell, talking about their collaborations with filmmaker Brian DePalma as a celebration of New York's ongoing contribution to the global film community. You can share this conversation through the website bit.do/framebyframe or via Twitter at @postny. Maurice, do you want to tell us how you first got involved?
Well, I first got involved with Scarface, but I had seen his films like Sisters, and but I'd seen Sisters in Europe, and I saw it there. And then I thought, I liked his films, I liked what he had to say. And a Mom, like Hi Mom, and, Greetings, I remember that. So so when I had the opportunity to work on this film, it was great. I mean, it was like, that was my first experience working on Scarface, and then continued working with him on other films, because I worked with Bill, who was his editor, and Jerry was his editor first, and so on. So then I kept working with Brian.
So connecting Brian to New York is just connecting just about anybody you work with, because there was 1600 Broadway, Broadway 48. There was 1619 Broadway, the Brill Building, and up on 54th Street there was a company called Trans Audio.
Yeah.
And so those three places were within blocks of one another. And that was basically my experience of the whole film business in New York.
That's right.
They might have had some stages, even in this building, perhaps, or across the street, where they shot stuff. But in terms of the post-production, it was a very small geographic area, and you couldn't help but physically come in contact with people when you're editing, giving them trims and everything. And also people in other films were on the floor or else across the street. They might be editing a film and you might be going to the mix. And there was a certain camaraderie that came about, and a feeling of that came out of that camaraderie from just being in that same small geographic circle. Yeah. And that was basically the whole New York post-production community. He always lived here. So when I worked with him, he had an apartment downtown, and when you had to send somebody down, whatever, he was always a New York person. And he had that same sort of attitude that we attribute to people like Scorsese and Lumet. And he was born in Newark, and he grew up, I guess, in Philadelphia, or maybe just outside of Philadelphia. But I just felt like we were always in Manhattan, working in the Midtown, 48th Street and Broadway. I remember when we got I forget which movie it was. Maybe it was Scarface, but we after a battle with the MPAA, because he had that window facing Broadway. We got the R rating sign and we stuck it in the window, or X rating, something like that. And we had taped it to the window so everybody could see it.
But I think at New York it's the vibe. Like in New York it's more gritty, and in LA they're more laid back. Everybody's laid back. Everybody's happy. There's a lot of talent out there, but it's a different way of approaching the work. I mean, I have to regress a little bit. When I started working, I was an assistant at one point, and I was on The Godfather, and they brought in this Bill Reynolds, who was a film editor, who passed by a nice man, but he came with a shirt and tie, and he was working in Moviola, and it was such a different way of working from people like Dee Dee Allen and Jerry Greenberg at the time when I was working with them. So it was like they were laid back. They just do the thing, take a thing. They go one cut. They do it. You've seen them work, have you, Bill?
Of course.
Yeah, and so they're just a whole different way of working. And here in New York is more intense. It's like more. It's the vibe of the city too. So everybody works in a different way, and I think that you feel that in the directors who work here and have chosen to work here for that reason. But to add to his example, when I was working, I think he might have been working on Kramer versus Kramer. Mm-hmm. It was on one floor. We were on the same floor. Raging Bull, Kramer versus Kramer, and I was working on All That Jazz. These three films were on one floor. Like we could walk right to each other. Am I right, Bill?
Yeah, right.
At the DGA building. So that was it. So that's an example of what he gave. So that's.
You have the energy.
We're all the same on the same floor. Three directors doing the. Well, you don't see that in L.A. I don't know.
There was another New York director, Fosse, of course.
Yeah. So.
Sure, and the proximity. You can't help but feel somehow connected to that. Yeah. I mean, certainly the '60s and '70s influenced everybody's culture at the time. There was a loosening rules and regulations and things kind of felt more opened up. And I think Brian just was that was part of his psyche also. But I do know that there were several times when we would get a cut of his film together, and he wouldn't really want to show it to anybody yet, but he'd show it to people like Martin Scorsese. He'd invite him to come and watch it, and then they would talk. So, but it was on more than one occasion. Martin Scorsese came in and watched the film and then left with Brian to discuss it.
But it was the time. I mean, that's when the golden age, so to speak, of which we are.
It reminds me of the other directors did that too.
Right.
Like Sidney Lumet, he brought a group of friends to see his film, or they would all get together. The whole New York community was very close, you know. Like he would bring Bob Fosse.
Was Arthur Penn in there too?
Arthur Penn, maybe, but Herb Gardner.
Herb Gardner.
So it was today, and Brian had his group, and they were other. But I think New York at the time was more. We were talking about it before. It's more collaborative.
Well, it was also the anti-studio town.
Right.
I think all of the people that we're talking about did not want to be in the studio production system unless they had Final Cut, I guess. But, that they were very protective of their authorship.
Yeah.
And
well,
that's, I think, what joined all of those people together.
Yeah, and that was a nice
And it was
thing.
it was an incredible thing. It was
because
lovely because they were making the movies, not the studio.
Right.
We worked for directors, not for studios.
Right.
And I didn't really appreciate it as much as I did later when I started to go to Hollywood to work on films, or we started in New York and work, and I saw how it worked out there. That executives would want to come into the editing room and work and sit and have some more influence. But in New York, we're so far away, they just physically couldn't do it. So occasionally, even now, they'll come to town, they'll ask to see whatever. But just having that physical separation, I think, gave them a bit of artistic freedom that they wouldn't have enjoyed. People in general wouldn't enjoy being so close inside the studio system. As Kris said.
And what Kris just said is true because it filtered down to sound and everybody else. You had freedom to do what you wanted to do. It wasn't, you were working for the director. That was it, 100%. That was it. You didn't, the producers, in my whole career, I never even thought of working for a producer.
Exactly.
I mean,
I've been working on films in Los Angeles, and I'd be in my car on the way to the ADR session. I'd get a phone call from a producer telling me that they want to change the ADR line from this such and such to such and such.
And New York didn't, as you said, didn't do filmmaking by the books. It was the way California did. They were totally wide open. It was like, it's interesting how the East Coast was the Wild West.
Right.
And that type of, and that style of filmmaking, where, as you say, it broke out and changed. And it also gave freedom to all of us in our own areas of work, in picture and sound. We could just take off and try different things. It didn't have to fit into the box.
Right.
We didn't have these strictures in place like that has been in place from the beginning of cinema. Obviously, mostly began out there and developed, and they developed their own rules and strictures and ways of doing things, which, as Lee was saying, New York didn't have to do.
No, it broke the rules.
Yeah, I mean, you had more freedom to do different things that you wanted to try. And whether it was acceptable or not is up to the director. And partly the editor as well. The editor had a lot to say, not just the director, because the editor was the voice of the director in relationship to the sound part I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I hardly ever spoke to Brian about sound on any film, and I worked at about 6 or 7 films, ever, except for Scarface. That was it. Other than that, it came from the picture editor, and you get some guidance a little bit, and then you do your thing, and that was it.
Right.
But we would always have pretty long discussion in cutting, and especially in temping.
Yeah, I'm talking about.
I know. I'm just saying that it was his feedback. Coming from.
Right. That's why I'm saying you get it from the picture editor.
Yeah, of course.
He relates the information to you, and he's coming from the director. So by the time it gets to
but he was at the mix the whole time, all the time. At least on the films I worked on, he was there all the time. And a lot of directors, they don't show up until you finish the mix.
Yeah.
Right. Well, he's evolved in that way. In my experience, he pretty much, like a lot of directors now, you finish the dialogue premix, and then he'll come in and listen to it, and sometimes he'll listen to the effects premix.
Right.
But he basically trusts us to, like the dailies, to help him achieve his vision. And then he comes and sits. He'll sit the whole time for the final mix usually.
And he knew exactly what he wanted. I mean, there wasn't, well, I don't know, take it in, put it out, maybe we'll try it again. And it was like, boom, no, good, out. I like that. Maybe once or twice in a mix he would, like, you felt like, I want to make it better, like I wanted to make it better, like a little bit, fix or something. I would, work on it for a little while, and he'd give you space to do it. And after about 20 minutes, he would say, in his manner, like, all right, guys, this is it. Leave it alone. That's it. He'd give you the room to do it, and when he felt it's good enough, you realized you were doing your own thing, or it wasn't good enough. He was fine with it before.
It wasn't what he wanted.
Right.
It wasn't good.
He was happy with it before, but he let you do your own. Maybe you'll make it a little better or whatever, but then after a while he said, okay, leave it alone, and he said it in a very affirmative way, a nice way, but affirmative, that said, okay, guys, leave it alone, that's it.
Supervising sound editor Dan Sable, whose credits include collaborations with Woody Allen, Bob Fosse, Robert Benton, Ang Lee, and Jonathan Demme, worked on over 6 feature films with Brian DePalma as a sound editor, and was the inspiration for the sound editor character played by John Travolta in Brian DePalma's BLOW-OUTt.
I didn't know anything about Brian before I started to work for him. And first film that I worked on was Phantom of the Paradise. And it was like a home movie. It was very low budget, but it looked expensive. And I had to do a scene in the film as an audition piece, and I passed the audition, so I got the job. We mixed that at Magnum Sound with Al Vermalia. It was a team. It was Brian and Paul Hirsch and me, and basically that was it. It was on the next BLOW-OUTt when we learned that the negative of a whole shoot in Philadelphia was stolen off the back of a truck.
Oh, God.
Well, the truck was parked, and the negative, I guess, was supposed to go to the lab. But somebody hopped on the truck and stole the boxes, and they never recovered. And a big pall descended over the mix, and it was horror and nightmare for around 3 or 4 days. But they brought in this guy who said that he could generate, a new negative off the work print, and they tried to do this, and nothing worked. As a result, they had to go back, and just reshoot everything. It was a bad period of time, I can tell you.
You can hear a more in-depth interview with Dan Sable conducted by sound effects editor Ira Spiegel and music editor Sherry Johansson in a one-on-one interview with Dan at bit.do/frame-by-frame. I asked Dan to describe the kind of conversation he had with Brian DePalma in developing the soundscape for a film.
Hardly any conversations at all. I just do what I thought should be done, and did what I liked, and then we screen it. And then make some changes or not, but most of the times it turned out fine. I was just worried all the time about staying ahead of it. That's all, because they never really told me what he wanted, in the film. But the films, it told me what to do.
I think you're right. I think because I've always, talking to people about working for Brian DePalma, I've always said that his dailies speak to you. And he also has himself said that form is content for him. And when you look at the cinematic form that's evident in all of his dailies, you can figure out exactly what a shot is intended for. And I was, like you say, you didn't know what he wanted, and you were worried about giving him what he wanted. And I still feel that way. And I'm like film 14, I think. But I always thought that Okay, I'll just try to figure out what the shot's designed for and make sure that it's included in the spot it's designed for. Then I can use that shot sometimes in other places to good effect, perhaps, or not if he changed his mind, if he didn't agree with me. But I've learned over the years more and more, so that shorthand that we have became shorter and shorter and shorter, the more familiar I became with his style of filmmaking. And that's worked to certainly a time advantage, but also he often storyboards his films, or at least very complicated sequences will have storyboards, including the film I'm working on now. And I always challenge myself to not look at the storyboards, actually, and then put the dailies together. Yeah. And once I've done the scene, and Chrissy, she's been with me and she's done it, look at the result that I have in the scene I've edited and see how close I got to the storyboard. Yeah. And of course, it's very satisfying if I did, and if I didn't, I just changed it before I showed it to him.
I think in conjunction with that, he also let the sound department, like Maurice, go out and do many other options without, obviously we didn't discuss it. And when we got to the mix, I mean, he had these beautiful sequences with, as we're saying, very little dialogue sometimes, and giving it the option of having layers of sound in the background to also put in effects that were not up close, not up front, to give more of an ambient feeling, and having effects covered 50 yards away or off screen or this and that, to enhance that visual effect that he wanted to get. It was an open book. He was giving Maurice the open sound, and when we were mixing, we would bring things in and out and up and down. Of course, you never really know how they're going to sound until you put them together. And he would love us to do that. We had people in the background over here, different sounds over here, all over the place. And if it didn't interfere with what he felt, they went in.
He was always interested in creating depth, not only in the sound, but in the visuals too.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you've seen it. Very often when there's a street scene in one of his films, and especially in New York, there's this orange and white column that sits on top of a sewer grate where the smoke comes out of the top. And one time I asked him, I said, why do they always have one of those things? He says, because it's lit up and it adds depth to the scene, so that there's a light, there's a legitimate light in the background that helps add depth to the scene, and it gives it perspective.
And his point of view thing just stayed with me my entire career, which is that he was so strict about point of view and told so much of the story that way that it really became my visual vocabulary, and I am indebted to him for that.
And Brian was always extremely generous, particularly on Casualties of War. I'm sure Chrissy remembers. They were finished shooting in San Francisco. Most of the time when you finish editing a film, you get a week as an editor. You get a week to keep working, and then the director comes in and watches you. You're expected to have a cut. So after shooting, you get a week. And I knew I had at least a month's worth of work, because there was a lot of material. And I was nervous about the fact that I wasn't. I felt like I didn't do my job well enough, whatever. And so, but he called. He was in Los Angeles, and he asked me what's going on, and I said, well, I told him, and he said, okay, I'll come back whatever it was. A month later, 4 weeks later, he came in, and then we were able to show him the cut.
And we were behind their shooting schedule so much.
And so we worked very hard on it. But sometimes the studio won't let you have that extra time either. But fortunately, he was able to, I guess, use his influence to make sure that we did the work that we needed to do. So you have that same time frame now, right, as we did when Casualties of War. But in today's technology world, you
have to do all the options.
During that week, you're supposed to have all sound effects. People expect to hear a movie. Maybe not Brian, because he's actually very understanding. He really wouldn't want this, but wouldn't expect it. But most directors today would. Is that all these sound effects are in, or enough to make sure that there's no holes or anything dramatic that needs to be filled in. All of the visual effects have to be temporary, done as much as possible. The green screens are done with the plates and all that, and a temp score. Which there's no music editor for. We, as the editors, do the temp score. So we've taken on all of that, and as we all know, digital technology doesn't allow us to work any faster, because we still can't short-circuit our thought process in arriving at an edit.
Right.
Okay, so and since that's the initial version when you're cutting the film the first time, when they're doing the dailies, the review process, the recutting and then saving the versions on your computer, that's all great, and you can review things faster in technology and recut the scene and address the director's concerns in fixing something. But that initial process that you're doing when you're editing the movie takes the same amount of time. And so it's become, our plates are a lot fuller. Now, that may help assistants, too, in that we ask them to do sound effects sometimes. We ask them to do the visual effects. We give them scenes to cut as much as possible. And that's another way to keep them involved and make them feel like they're part of the project, which they are.
De Palma's darkest films were often scalded by controversy, as in 1968, when a 4-tier rating system, G, M, R, and X, went into effect, and Brian De Palma's Greetings, starring a young Robert De Niro, landed the first ever X rating for its significant sexual content. Later, Scarface would face down an X rating until it was later revised to an R rating. Here, his collaborators describe his extreme violence and bloodshed as kin to opera buffo or exaggerated drama as definitive of the cinematic.
I just saw Scarface like a year ago or something and just couldn't. The violence was so over the top that for a filmmaker, it was funny. Yeah. You know, it's really. It's sometimes I think of it as opera buffo, but he goes out there in a way as the visual storyteller. You can, and I find it humorous and amazing, you know.
I just want to say about Scarface, the very end of the film, I remember, well, you were out there, Bill, weren't you in L.A.?
Sure.
They were still mixing, and I was still cutting, like next door, like in a little cutting room. And they were, I think Marty Bregman came and looked at the cut, at the sort of mix. It wasn't final yet, and he wanted more. You ever seen the film?
Yeah.
At the very end is like everything. It's like craziness.
Yeah.
And he said, "Well, it's not enough gunshots here." Sound. Jerry comes out and says, they want more. I said, Jerry, I don't know. He said, go back there, put more stuff in. Machine guns, and it was already like there's a fire going on, there's explosion, and then I didn't know what to do. I went to another cutting room to some guy, another editor. I said, do you have anything explosive? She said, I got nitroglycerin explosion. This is a mag. I said, give it to me. I put it in, I put everything in. Everybody was happy, but I thought, Jesus, before that, it was hell already. But it wasn't Brian, that came from Marty Bregman, or maybe Brian too, I don't know, I just got the word. But the thing is that the part of it was an exaggeration. Yeah. Everything was an exaggeration of the situation.
And that was like what it was cinematic about.
Like even when somebody got hit over the head, like which I've done a number of times on his films, it was over the top, like it was not funny, but in a way you could think of it as it's so over the top that it's not real, Yeah.
I meant uncomfortable.
It makes you feel uncomfortable.
CARLITO'S WAY. There's a scene.
The boat.
There's a scene in the back of the boat, and there's one of the characters in the water, and Sean Penn's character hits him on the head with a baseball bat, and it goes on for like a minute, and it's going, and then we finally get it just right, and we play it for Brian, and he says, that's great, but they're not loud enough. I want to make them even more.
It's true, I remember that.
He says, I want more. More. I said, we looked at each other, we go, more, my God.
And I went and got a pig's head to do that.
We had a head on top.
I had a pig's head and put it, don't
we sent Jen, the apprentice, who was a vegetarian, told her to go to the butcher store on 9th Avenue and buy a pig's head or a sheep's head, and she wouldn't do it because she was, so somebody else went and got it.
Right.
And we brought it into the Foley studio next door to the mix. Right. This was in getting it even before he wanted it loud enough, just to get the sound to sound good. And we tried to do the same thing. We were banging on this animal, sheep's head, let's say, with something hard to try to make the cracking sound. And it still wasn't right. And then one of us got the idea to just take the jaw and separate the jaw from the thing. And that cracking sound that made was like perfect. And we put it in, and then he said, okay, we all agreed it sounded good, and then Lee got to make it louder. It's louder.
Brian goes, "Wait, what's in there? I want to hear that. Make that one loud. Make that loud."
But that was his. That was his. It was an exaggeration of the situation. And so. I mean, I liked working with him a lot. I thought it was great.
Yeah.
I really did. I thought it was a lot of work because it was very detailed. A lot of things going on. I think he paid attention to a lot of things, and I think that it was a hard job just doing all the things that you saw on the screen. There's a lot on the screen all the time.
It's what we said before with the visual depth. He wanted the same thing with the sound.
Right, and I think you're led by how good a job he did in shooting it. That makes you want to up your game too. To stay on par.
Yeah, like SCARFACE, like other things like that.
It's difficult to shock the audience now and have that same kind of exaggerated effect.
Exactly.
Everybody's become so inured to things like violence and blood, and so how do you shock them, or how do you grab their attention and make them stay with the movie or with the moment because that's a tool you don't have anymore. Let's say. So.
And the other thing too is it wasn't continuous violence all the time. It was very specific.
Right.
1 or 2 times in the film there was a
set piece.
That's right.
Every film he does has 1 or 2 or 3 set pieces. But we've had always had occasion to try to make the MPAA provide the rating that the studio wanted, and Brian made his movie, and it got a certain rating, and that was that. But then the studios were always insisting that for release for distribution purposes, and in the old days even for newspaper advertisements, you couldn't have a NC, whatever the equivalent of NC-17 rating. You had to have like an R rating, and so we addressed that in SCARFACE and in Casualties of War, and in Snake Eyes certainly. I remember one in Snake Eyes where we were asked to. There was a scene where there's the woman, Carla Gugino's wearing a white blouse, and the guy who she works for gets shot, so there's blood all over her dress throughout the rest of the film, her white thing, and so. That and other places they've asked us to tone down the blood, whether it's color or whatever. But I remember we got down to a point where I think, I believe in this case that we're trying to get a PG-13. I'm not sure, whatever it is, to knock the rating down a notch. And we had taken the blood out of a sleeve, and we showed it to them a few times. And finally, after all of this sort of machinations and several, because it was all done, this was a film opticals, it wasn't digital visual effects, so it was much more time consuming and difficult to execute. And when we finally did what we thought they wanted, and we presented it, they still said no.
Huh.
So I think it just ended up being the way it was before.
Yeah.
And then there was a lot of controversy about that. I did a film with him called Redacted. Mm-hmm. Which has to do with people blowing themselves up. And the film I'm working with him on now, called Domino, has a couple of similar situations where there's suicide bombers. So, but the reason that resonates and maybe shocks people is because it's so real.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's not the grand opera violence, which is so cartoonish and so over the top that it takes you out of it and you enjoy it on another level. This is reality. So he's shocking us now, like so many other filmmakers and documentary and whatever, and the news is shocking us with these, as we had yesterday, these instances of something that feels really close to home. So that gets you when there's something that happens so now it's not like outside of us. Now it's something that's potential for anybody in today's world, and that's kind of shocking.
The music in this episode is by Ennio Morricone from the soundtrack to The Untouchables, and Pino Donaggio from Blow-Out. The sound mixer for this episode was Josh Hurley. Frame by Frame is co-presented by the Motion Picture Editors Guild and Post New York Alliance because it's how you finish that counts. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes featuring the collaborators of Spike Lee. In New York, I'm your host, Isabel Sadurni, and this is Frame by Frame.